I've been doing some research that has to do with the roots of American mass communication research, and also the interrelationship between mass communication research and American psychological warfare after World War II. And what turns up is that a number of sort of the founding fathers of mass communication research were on the government's payroll for 20 years and undertook projects that they could market to the government and also to private clients. And one of the effects that this had, I think, is that it distorted the field of mass communications research. In other words, we know quite a bit about the effect or non-effects of television on its viewers. There's, whole encyclopedias of statistical reports about this type of television has that type of effect, and questionnaires and back and forth. But still in all, we know relatively little about the communications process, and particularly we don't know very much about communications for any purpose other than manipulating people. The whole thrust of the field in those years was, what is the best way to manipulate an audience? What are the magic keys by which we could use through television, through radio, through distribution of leaflets, whatever it is, that the government could use to get them to do what they wanted, both as far as American citizens are concerned and as far as foreign audiences are concerned. And one must admit that persuading people to do things is certainly part of what communication is about. But it's not the whole thing. There's another aspect of communication that is more basic and in a certain sense more humane, which has to do with sharing and communion. It's the root word is the same root. So what does this mean? Okay, so getting back to the theme about intelligence that we've been discussing here. During the 1950s, we know, and we can document today, the government undertook very large-scale propaganda campaigns aimed at shaping American public opinion as to what we were supposed to think about foreign affairs, how we were supposed to look at the German question, how we were supposed to look at what was going on in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and so on. And the particular vehicle through which this was done had to do with the National Committee for a Free Europe and a number of its allied organizations. Now, the story here is this, is that immediately after World War II, the U.S. wanted to maintain diplomatic relations with countries like Hungary and Poland and Romania and so on. At the same time, because those countries had been overrun by the Red Army during the war, there was a strong trend in the U.S. government towards overthrowing the very same governments. And in fact, it was part of our policy to try to instigate revolutions in Eastern Europe and, if possible, inside the Soviet Union itself. Now, some of the people that we were using in order to pursue this policy were extreme right-wing political groups that had been on the payroll of Berlin during World War II. You remember the Nazis invaded these countries during the course of the war, particularly the Soviet Union I'm referring to now, and they would set up puppet governments in the areas under German control. Well, the same people who had run those puppet governments, and who, by the way, had also run the mass extermination programs during the Nazi occupation, they retreated back to West Germany at the end of the war. Well, so the brainstorm in American psychological warfare operations after World War II is that we would put these same people on the payroll as propagandists and covert operators and different sorts of agents, and instigate revolutions inside the communist countries in Eastern Europe. So that was one half of the psychological warfare campaign of those days. The other side of this was that these kind of programs were rather expensive, At the same time, there was also a very large military escalation going on in the United States, which was extremely expensive. We were paying more spending more on our military in 48 and 49 at a time when we were ostensibly at peace, 49 certainly, than we had during the height of World War II. So it became necessary to try to convince the American people that we had to do this, and we had to pay these taxes, that we had to have the military forces abroad, and so on. And one way that was done was through the CIA. The CIA created this National Committee for a Free Europe. It was two people mainly were responsible for putting this together. It's George Kennan, who was then at the State Department, and Allen Dulles, who was then in private practice as a lawyer, but who later would become director of the CIA. And they put together these Free Europe committees that the emigre groups that I was discussing a moment ago, they would put these emigre groups on the payroll, so that that was the channel through which money was passed to these organizations, some of which had collaborated with the Nazis during the war for use as psychological warfare operators. Well, to bring it back to the United States, most people who are, I don't know, 30, from their mid-30s or older, will remember the Radio Free Europe promotions on television, the Let Freedom Ring promotions, and send in your nickels and dimes to support Radio Free Europe. And the fact of the matter is, Radio Free Europe's bills are being paid by the CIA, and a sister project, which was known as Radio, it started out as Radio Liberation from Bolshevism, but is now today known as Radio Liberty. The bills of those organizations were actually being paid by the Central Intelligence Agency. The agency, in what, at least in my opinion, is a violation of the law, secretly underwrote the activities of a group called Crusade for Freedom that was the main propaganda arm of these psychological warfare operations in the United States. And the Crusade for Freedom got about $5 million to start out with to produce commercials. They produce radio commercials, TV, newspaper, magazine promotions, and so on. And the various private media outlets were given tax deductions in order to publish these advertisements and these promotions. Well, the point of these promotions, and you can read this in the group's own literature, was to convince the American people to support the U.S. government's strategy in Eastern Europe. Now, whether or not one agrees with that strategy, it is evident that the U.S. government has no business propagandizing in this fashion to the American people. They work for us, not the other way around. And more than that, they realized that at the time that this was probably illegal. So to what, how big was this program? Well, its initial budget was $5 million, and you can go back and you can look at what did $5 million buy in terms of media time during the early 1950s. Well, the amount of money that the CIA spent trying to convince the American people to follow the CIA's strategy in Europe was more money than the combined total of all the money that was spent on the Dewey-Truman election campaign of 1948. The CIA was the largest political advertiser in the United States during the early 1950s. And only the commercial giants like General Motors and Procter & Gamble and so on were spending more money trying to sell ideas to the American people. So part of and this program was simply a component of a much more complex group of programs designed to manipulate people through the media. The agency had its own guys in certain newspapers. It had the capability of planting stories in different media. It had quite a number of scholars on its payroll, and so on. And the director of these programs is a man by the name of Frank Wisner. He used to refer to his mighty Wurlitzer. Wurlitzer is an old type of organ that could make all different sorts of sounds, and he would talk about how through manipulation of the press he could make the newspaper scream, or make them purr, or make them do what he wanted. And part of the effect of this is that the government, and particularly the agency, was able to set the parameters of what were legitimate ideas and what were not legitimate ideas, particularly as far as foreign affairs are concerned. They were able to say, in effect, that it was okay to think maybe this far, but no farther than that. And that ability, we see that ability still today when we're looking at the situation in Latin America, when we're looking at the situation in Eastern Europe, is that because of its money, because of its credibility, because of its ability to advance a scholar's career or to block a person's career, the government intelligence agencies can shape what we think and what we see on the media about, particularly about foreign affairs questions. I think that that's very dangerous, because we're a very powerful country. We have enormous influence and impact on other people's lives. And for the most part, we are quite ignorant about what our impact on their lives is. And when you have the government with rather substantial influence on telling us what our impact on these people's lives is, one gets a sort of institutionalized ignorance about American role in foreign affairs that I think is part of what explains why we seem to why our strategy overseas seems to keep blowing up in our face. Where does this blowback phenomena come from? Say in Panama, for example. Part of the explanation for this is that the information that we're told about what's going on, particularly in third world countries, is often shaped by people who have a rather large interest in selling one policy or another policy.
My name is Ronald Reagan. Last year, the contributions of 16 million Americans to the Crusade for Freedom made possible the World Freedom Bell, symbol of hope and freedom to the communist-dominated peoples of Eastern Europe, and built this powerful 135,000-watt Radio Free Europe transmitter in Western Germany. This station daily pierces the Iron Curtain with the truth, answering the lies of the Kremlin and bringing a message of hope to millions trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Grateful letters from listeners smuggled past the secret police express thanks to Radio Free Europe for identifying communist quislings and informers by name. The Crusade for Freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism. Join now by sending your contributions to General Clay, Crusade for Freedom, Empire State Building, New York City. Or join in your local community.